Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to have conversations and meet some friends along the way. So I'm really excited for my guest today. My guest is Philip. Philip, do you want to go ahead, say hello, introduce yourself?
Hi. Well, obviously I'm Philip. I live in Australia, and we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah. I thank you again for hopping on, chatting with me. I know that time zones are weird, but hopefully we'll have a great conversation. It'll be worth taking some time out of your Saturday. Um, Right. So I guess, let's get from the get. So, tell us a little bit about, kind of how you got started in tech. Like, was there a particular point in time in your life where you came across technology and you're like, this is the thing, this is the thing that I want to work on the rest of my life?
Yeah, like I grew up in Southern California, early '80s and '90s, so I'm pretty old now. My first PC was a Packard Bell Legend 606 with a whopping 4 megabytes of RAM and
All right.
85, 85 megs of disk space, and the processor speed was 25 megahertz. So yeah, and that was something that was just given to me when I was like 12, um, and like a lot of guys in tech, I just jumped straight into it. I was reading all the manuals, and I remember memorizing the DOS 6.22 manual, even Windows at the time. So, but yeah, it's I on my day to day, I'm an engineering manager, which is just another way of saying a retired developer.
Sure.
Um, but effectively, I about a little over 2 decades ago, I started like everybody else. But there's a longer story is that I started in Cali, um, and you're probably wondering where open source falls in. And the interesting part is that I'm actually in Australia because of open source and the stuff that I
Oh,
did
okay.
back in the early days of .NET. Um, I used to do a lot of talks on conferences and things like that. Um, but my 15 minutes of fame are up. But back in the day, it was I I went around the world a couple of times, and it was all because of something I just kind of sat around in my room and just started pushing to GitHub and working on things. And well, actually, at the time, it wasn't even GitHub; it was Code Project. But the stuff that I was particularly passionate on was really around .NET.
Yeah.
Even the days of .NET 2.0, .NET Core 2, .NET 2.0, and beyond, or even .NET 1,
Sure.
the CLR 2.0. But my thing was, my claim to fame at the time was around metaprogramming, um, building things into using the C# language to add extensions and make C# do things that you would think you couldn't do, just being able to manipulate IO. That means just taking somebody else's code, uh, reading it, rewriting it, because of how .NET is built with a lot of metadata under the covers, and being able to change anything that I want. And I just did it as a hobby. So this was back in the early 2000s. So around the time IOC containers came around, and people were just starting to write them. I think I wrote the first or second gen, one of them, which was Linfu at the time. And I learned a lot because for me, my thing, even to this day, even though I don't really make any money out of it directly, is metaprogramming, uh, or just like baking in language features. I mean, those
Sure.
kinds of things that I tinker with, uh, just for fun. Because there's not, unless you're working inside of DevDiv and inside of Microsoft, you're probably not going to make that much money at all doing this kind of stuff. But for me, this is kind of, as I've said in many tweets, is this is like my ship in the bottle. Yes, there are people that build better ships. There's no doubt about that. But I like building my tiny little ship in the bottle, and this is what I like doing, even
Yeah.
if it might not um, get me any money out of that.
I mean,
So
yeah. And that's great. Sorry, you were in the middle of saying something.
yeah. So, I mean, it started off as me just look. I'm a pretty lazy person, so at first when I said, "Hey, this code gen thing is pretty cool. What could I do with it?" So when I was younger, I took CodeDom and there was this really old tool back in the day called Codesmith, and this was even before the days of people actually write these clone open source versions of commercial products. But for me, I had no experience. I wanted to see if I could do it. So there was a couple of things. I wrote my own version of Codesmith
Oh, wow.
back in the day. That was a templating engine plugged into a WinForms app, which is essentially what it was. And because of how CodeDom was, if you had a different CodeDom provider, you could do things in like C Sharp, VB.NET. And since it was a very primitive abstract syntax tree, what it would do is it would just switch, you just switch the provider and you can generate another language. But it's like a gateway drug. You start with CodeGen, and then I realized that there's something called system.reflection, and I said, okay, that's cool. And then there's system.reflection.emit that allows me to create new assemblies, create new programs. And then all of a sudden, you could actually do this in memory. So all of a sudden, you don't have to worry about generating text anymore. So no more text. Now I can just create stuff out of nowhere and have it running. And then later down the track, I learned that there's something called CISO or CESO, which allows you to read in assemblies and modify them, whereas system.reflection.emit in .NET doesn't. It's basically a write-only API or SDK. So you can create assemblies, but you can't change existing ones.
Interesting.
So, and this was like 2008, 2000, the 2010s. But the idea was that if you could take something, read it into memory, and modify it, you could pretty much inject whatever you want. You can do things like modify other people's code, even if you don't have their source code. And this was just the basic stuff. So that was one thing I've been tinkering with for, is it a decade now? And I've been doing it on and off over the years. But the reason, like I said earlier, I started off just tinkering, and I never thought that it would get me anywhere, really. I've had people said, you know what, it's a nice toy, I guess. But, like a lot of other earlier .NET devs, if you pick a niche and you pretty much ride it until the very end, you can get yourself into a few conferences in a few different places around the world.
Sure.
So for me, around the .com boom and bust in the early 2000s, after that I took a break. I went to Southeast Asia, studied in university for a while. But as I was studying in university, I just kept publishing things and just working on just tinkering around. So around 2010 or 11, I caught the attention of quite a few different people for some of the stuff I was doing in metaprogramming. And after I lived in the Philippines for a while, I went off to Hong Kong for a couple of years. And then from there, I got, offers to go to, I went to NDC Oslo around that same year, 2011, 2012. So that was pretty crazy because for me,
Sure.
this was like the first time I had somebody out of the blue said, "Hey, we'll fly you all the way halfway around the world from Hong Kong all the way to Norway, just to talk about something for an hour."
Yeah.
And then for the rest of the week, you can just kind of hang around the hotel, the conference area, and explore the fjords.
Yeah.
That was cool.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely. Yeah, sorry, you were finishing?
No, did you want to ask me something? Yeah.
No, I just say it's funny. There's a lot to unpack there. I think one of the things that's very interesting about technology and open source is kind of the group of people that you meet along the way, right? And I think for folks that really get into um, public speaking specifically, like you mentioned, speaking at NDC, which is kind of one of the big tech conferences for Microsoft Center Technology, and there's locations that they do conferences they do all over the globe. It's very interesting because it's kind of addictive, right? Like that speaking in front of people, that getting to meet other people, after your sessions or before your sessions, networking, getting to explore new areas that you typically wouldn't go to unless, like you said, like you had the opportunity to, like whether there was some travel accommodations covered or people just, you wanted to, get the word out for something that you were working on, right? And I think that's really, really interesting. So, there's one of the things that you said that was really interesting is you know, you kind of watched as being a typical like a .NET developer when .NET was not open source, right? Like you were working
Yeah.
on things that, and now like .NET is like a very open source concept, right? Like you can go in and see what the team is doing. You can, check out the latest version of their code base that hasn't even been like quote unquote released yet. You can engage with folks on different social platforms and even on GitHub. Like, how is that, that transition, like, from somebody who's wasn't directly part of the team, like that is a member of the community, like, what was that experience like?
It's better, definitely. Um, but I would say it's a mixed bag. Because back in the day, there's you in the early days, you if you put in a request to Microsoft support, what they would do is log a ticket for you and then toss the ticket in the bin. They say, forget it. I'm not going to waste any time on you. Nowadays, with not that different, except they're doing it out in the open. Unless there's a huge uproar, which did happen recently with the stuff with hot reloads and whatnot. I don't have too much insight into that. It's almost like Microsoft has changed in that you can see what they're doing, but you can't necessarily. It's like you're still behind a pane of glass. You could see what they're doing, but if they decide to go one direction, and you're just one dev, or you're even like a couple hundred of them, and you don't have much clout, then sorry, they're going to do what they want to do.
I mean,
So
there's
it's not.
something, yeah, there's something interesting to say there. I think one of the things that's, important to call out is that, you know, yeah, your point about like listening to one dev, that doesn't happen because, there are millions of .NET developers out there, right? Like maybe not millions, but hundreds of thousands of people that have worked on .NET over their career. But I think one of the things that's very interesting is that you do have like the ability to engage with the community and help provide value in the way that you can, right? Like you mentioned public speaking or blogging or live streaming. I think that there's plenty of opportunities for you to kind of better the .NET ecosystem without engaging directly with Microsoft. I think one of the things that
Yeah.
at least makes the experience a bit better now is that, you know, you can actually see the prioritization of things, right? Like you can go in and you can look at the GitHub projects, you can look at GitHub issues, and you can have conversations with team members about what they're working on. Obviously, business priorities are very important, but it's a bit different than completely closed source, right? Where you expect to see a new version of the framework every year and a half, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely gotten better in that sense.
Yeah.
Um, I think for me, one of the reasons why I disengaged a lot more from .NET open source, other than my tinkering that I do now, just as a hobby, it's just it doesn't pay anything.
Sure.
And oh, okay, fine, fair enough that it didn't pay anything back then, but today there was the corporate component where you have somebody expecting you to pay to work on it completely for free without any kind of compensation. So, for example, I back in the day, I built like 3 IOC containers. I ended up I ended up supporting one of them, and later on I found out it was used in quite a handful of companies. Another story was that one of the derivatives, or those written by one of my proteges, uh, ended up being used by the company I used to work for. So it's kind of
Sure.
weird, you rock up to a place and then they're using one of the tools that you helped design, um, and you got nothing for it.
Yeah, I
So
mean, yeah, there's some negative like side effects with open source, right? Like it's wrought with the ability to be manipulated by, bad actors. I think that
yeah,
one thing that's very interesting to me about open source is that, to your point, like it is for the most part free work, and people are taking time out of their life to work on some of these things. And sure, there are entities like large companies or teams at large companies that contribute a lot to open source, and that's great. But for the most part, a majority of open source is done by folks like you and me, right? Like we don't get specifically paid to do it. If you're able to take an open source concept or something that you've built and monetize it, that's a great example of being able to kind of champion that. Like there's plenty of open source technologies out there that have kind of turned into monetary streams for people to be able to survive on, right? Like we've had,
yeah,
people on the show that, they work for companies that are open source that make money and they're able to pay their mortgage, which I think is great. But I think to your point, it's very valid that for the most part, open source is done by people who aren't doing it for the money.
yeah, and that's fine. I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's cool. For me, what I got out of it was the marketing opportunities and the networking opportunities. And then when I, played my musical chairs and the music stopped, I landed in Australia, and I'm happy. I'm still riding off into the sunset and enjoying life. Um, but for the most part, it depends on what you want to get out of it. And I've met quite a few people with different perspectives on it. Uh, for example, Aaron, from one of the authors of and founders of Acco.net, he pointed out on a couple of occasions that this is because of misaligned incentives, and I tend to agree. The challenge is not a lot of people have his ability to say, you know what, this isn't going to work out, or I can monetize this and actually turn it into a working, saleable product that I can support out in the
Sure.
open. Um, for me, it's interesting as somebody who's started with .NET Beta and followed it all the way through, and I could see that it's gotten better in some ways, but it's almost this uncomfortable tie-in with Microsoft. Well, yes, you've got a community that wants to build great things, but there's other people out there that are a bit cautious because Microsoft has a tendency to clone a lot of their open source projects, or not clone or even fork, but it just make their own versions, and all of a sudden it eclipses the original version. And then the people who work in enterprise say, hey, you know what, if I have to choose between this version and the one that Microsoft supports, I'm going to go with Microsoft because they're going to be longer than whoever this other person is who decided to build it in the garage.
Yeah, I think all companies in general, they make decisions that are best for their business, right? And sometimes um, that's taking advantage of other, smaller developments that are being done by smaller companies. Large companies
But
buy small companies all.
it's within your own community
I
for the tools and the things that you support, which I think is a bit self defeating.
Yeah, I mean that there's definitely some concerns. I think one of the things that I'd love to talk about with you specifically is, you know, with obviously open source is something that you're very passionate about. I think that the fact that you want to have a conversation about it with me is telling of that. Like, so what are some of the things that you're working on these days in open source that really excite you?
Um, it's still along the lines of metaprogramming. I've had a couple of ideas that I've bounced back and forth, and I've been playing around with for well over a decade. Um, so for me, I've taken the idea of assembly modification, and and it's not revolutionary, but it's certainly different. And everybody talks about mocking frameworks, but what I'm working on is the ability to monkey patch anything in .NET. So I could take anybody's assembly and in and even though I don't have their source code, I can redirect method calls, replace them. I can completely redirect everything inside of, say, a class or an entire assembly so that I can simulate what the software will do if I unplugged all the external outputs. So, for example, if I had some sort of application that your typical application that called out to a database, and I wanted to test it end to end, but I don't want it to call a database. In a simple example, I could disconnect it and I could simulate what happens if I run different inputs through it without actually seeing the source code. It's basically white box testing on steroids because since I control every single input and output, I can change any method inside of any class and I can change any instruction, then I can do things like software simulation. Everybody talks about mocking. Sure, yes, you can change one component and they can behave like any given component. That's something everybody does now. But I'm actually talking about the inverse of mocking, which is I change everything around a component because I control pretty much anything around it. So if I could take a single component and actually white box test it and run different inputs through it, I can tell you exactly where it's going to fail because I have 100% control over it. So for me, it's being able to have this level of fluidity and being able to change assemblies that way. Of course, I've had some pretty interesting discussions that didn't really go anywhere with various people in the .NET community because I said, hey, I want to change NuGet packages as I pull them down. That didn't go well.
Why do you think that didn't go
But
well?
it didn't go well because, for example, with Microsoft, if you ask somebody within Microsoft to allow you to do that, they're basically you're asking them, give me the keys to your house. They're never going to do that. But
But
as somebody outside in the community, I could do that fairly easily.
do
It's
you
just a question of what Microsoft certainly has that I don't have is the reach.
but let's not talk about Microsoft, right? Let's talk about just some other entity. Like let's say for instance you're a company who makes money off building third-party components for .NET. Do you
Yeah.
think it's fair to be able to modify their solutions without their permission?
Well, no, but then again, it's really up to you and what licenses and what laws you have to follow. I mean, these are tools by
It's not
themselves.
about law, it's not about licensing in legal, but it's about, let's just even take it even another step away, right? Well, let's say I open or I have an open source program that I've created. Maybe it's a NuGet package, like you said, but it's built by me, and you are going and modifying it in a way that is kind of against the, I guess, the general theme or the general feel for what I want to do with my platform, right? Do you think that that is something that's valid regardless of licensing?
It's something that you can do. I'm not sure if it's ethically sound.
Sure. I guess my point is that you know we want to talk about how we want to empower the community to be, you know, working with each other to kind of better the community. And if we are going down paths of creating scenarios where we're modifying works of the community because we can. Like, is there
Yeah.
really something about building upon the community in a positive way?
Well, this isn't a negative two either. But okay, give me a second. I got sorry, bio break. It's one of those things. So yeah, here. Let me just I'll be back.
Okay,
Yep. Hold on, let me just pause this.
no worries. Awesome.
I'll be back. Yeah.
So yeah, I think while Philip goes in, he takes a little bit of a bio break. I think one of the things that I love talking about is kind of how we can champion the work of great developers in the open source community. So like, if there's anybody here that loves talking about community, I would love for them to speak up in the different threads that we have here. One thing that I really, really think is impactful too is about being able to work with other developers to solve problems. So, like for instance, I own a couple of open source projects that allow the facilitation of different things, kind of connecting pieces. But I don't want to write all of those things myself. I want to be able to, go down this path of working with other developers that have maybe solved problems already for me and act as kind of a conduit to create solutions that make sense, right? And I think that's what's really, really great about the community. Whether it's technical communities or communities across different areas of work, like it's all about like standing on the shoulders of giants to be successful, right? And I think that's really, really ideal, and that's what I really enjoy about the community. Again, yeah, I think at the end of the day, we also run into scenarios where the community is great, but also the community is wrought with the potential for folks to do things in a way that doesn't really make sense. And one of the things, hey, Philip, thanks for coming back. I think one of the
Yeah.
things that I would love to hear from you, I was just talking a little bit with the audience about like ways that we can, promote the success of communities, right? And we don't need to be specific about calling out particular projects and things like that, but like, what is our responsibility as developers and folks in the technical community to kind of amplify the great work of some of our other colleagues, as well as kind of build on that next generation of success, and how we can make sure that technical communities are strong for the foreseeable future.
Well, I'd say there has to be. I think over the past decade or so, Microsoft has always pimped out the Microsoft MVP program, but I don't see any kind of community
I'm
equivalent
not, just
of
so we're
that.
clear, I'm not talking about Microsoft. I'm talking about
No,
the
but I'm just saying that one. Okay, let's put Microsoft aside. But my question is there any kind of community recognition that where we award people for their contributions aside from paying them buckets of money?
there's plenty of companies that do all sorts of things to empower the work of the community. AWS has AWS Heroes, and Google has Google Developer Experts, and GitHub has GitHub Stars, and Microsoft has the MVP program. And there's lots of entities out there that exist to kind of champion the work of the community. Is it 100% successful in all scenarios? Probably not. But I think in general, like, I think that the community also is the best filter for success in the community. Like if you're a community champion and you're doing great stuff, people are going to know about the work that you're doing. Because whether it's being referenced by other larger packages or it's being called out by more influencer types in the technical space, like it's all about figuring out ways to reward the great actors that are in the communities, right?
Yeah. And again, it really depends on what your motivations are. I mean, a lot of people go into open source for lots of different reasons.
Sure.
Like for me, I went in because I was just a starting dev. I had no idea, what how good or bad my code was. And I was just looking for feedback from other people within the
Yeah.
community because I was like, well, hey, it's kind of like somebody with a mixtape. Hey, could you, listen to my
Yeah.
mixtape and tell me if it's good or not?
that's a great analogy, right? Like the mixtape idea of like, hey, here's some stuff that I think might work. Like, is it going to work? And I think like I mentioned a little bit earlier, like the community is the biggest filter for this stuff, right? If you do something in the community that isn't satisfactory, the community lets you know about it, right? We've talked about that a
Oh
little
yeah.
bit. But at the same time, like if you're a community champion and the community will embrace you and let you and elevate you to a place that you've never been. Like there's plenty of people in the technical space that they wouldn't be as popular as they are or as influential as they are. Popular is not a fair word. As influential as they are, if not for communities, right? Like everybody
Yeah.
has their tech celebrities that they follow, right? And I think those folks wouldn't be where they are without the community championing them.
No, that's for sure. I mean, part of the reason why I got into the whole conference circuit was I wanted to be like the tech equivalent of Almost Famous. That old movie from the 2000s where you've got this writer kid chasing these celebrities around and being almost at the forefront of everything, while the celebrities were the ones that are doing all these big talks. Like for me, I'm certainly not famous, but there's quite a few people that I met along the way that were
Sure.
really interesting to get to know
Yeah.
um, in the process. Now, back to your earlier point, you were asking me, based on the stuff I build, is that a good idea? Do you want to subvert the community? I'm like, well, no, I don't want to do that. But my goal is I like doing this stuff. If it helps somebody, great. If you decide to use it for a supply chain attack, that's why I can't take responsibility for that. But that being said, that even though I like to think that it's revolutionary, this is stuff that's available in other languages,
Sure.
other languages that are more dynamic than, say, the languages on the CLI, for example.
Interesting.
Uh, and that, so, for example, monkey patching is something that you'd have in the, I guess you could say, JavaScript, Python, pretty much any language that allows you to dynamically change what's running as it's running. So
Yeah.
I like so being able to do that in .NET, it's not as groundbreaking as it sounds.
Sure. And I think it's about finding new ways to solve problems, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all developers, and how we make money as developers is by solving problems for businesses, right? Typically.
Yeah,
And I think at the end of the day, like if we're able to create some process or some workflow that allows developers to be effective and to solve their particular business problem, that's great. Like that's an amazing thing, and you know the community recognizes that, right? I think that's one of the great things about community is that, like I said, they're a filter. It doesn't matter how much time you've put into the work that you're doing. If you build something and the community's like, "No, this isn't cool," or "This isn't great," like nobody will use your tool, and then what's the point? I think. But I think that in general, like it's very exciting to hear that you're thinking about things that are being done in other languages and taking them to languages that these processes don't exist in yet.
yeah. So and for me, I get nothing out of it. It's just kind of an odd curiosity that I've
Yeah,
had for a while. And for me, as a tiny, it's a tiny hill, but it's a hill that I'd happily die on because it's, for me, it's just building stuff. And I dare say, when, but I'm not building stuff, I'm building stuff in other ways. So
yeah,
for me, I'm also a gamer. So if the trinity of building games seems to be Factorio, Satisfactory, and Dyson Sphere Program. I mean, any one of those three, I'll be rotating between them if I'm not coding, which is kind of ironic because they're all about building stuff.
yeah,
I love building stuff.
yeah. And I
Um,
mean, here's a random question for you. Were you a bit of a tinkerer when you were younger? Were you somebody who really was interested in how things were built? Like you took apart VCRs or remote control cars or stuff like that growing up? Because because one of the threads that I found after having this conversation with folks so many times is there a lot of people just really, really enjoy figuring out how things work.
Yeah, well, in my own baby book, from when I was a kid, my mother specifically wrote, touches everything in sight, sticks finger in electric socket out of curiosity. Um, so yeah, I was a tinkerer for, geez, 4 decades now. And hasn't really stopped.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, so do you remember a particular time when uh, you weren't able to figure out something? Because I think one of the things that I remember vividly growing up is um, I never I never ran into a situation where I couldn't fix something. Like I took apart my computer when my like the first computer we had, I took it apart day two, and I remember my dad saying, he came upstairs and the computer was in shambles, and he said, "Just fix this now." And I remember it took a couple of days for me to kind of re-engineer how a computer works, but I eventually did it. Like, do you have a scenario where you weren't able to solve something and you kind of got that piece of being able to just kind of walk away from it?
Oh, later in life, yes. I tried building my own version of Reflector. I got
Okay.
to the read-only side, but I gave up when I tried to write my own reflection.emit.
Okay.
And that was a pain in the ass, because one of the things that they don't tell you when you're writing something like that is you have to worry about processor alignments and byte alignments. And all the authors that I went to and I said, "Can you tell me a little bit about where you learned this?" And they just kind of shrugged and said, "I just figured it out." And I never
Interesting.
figured it out, but it was really interesting because I spent a good amount of time reading ECMA 335 and writing a metadata reader that matched the spec.
Interesting.
So I got to a point where I was actually reading in an entire assembly. I could tell you what's in a method. I could tell you what the structure is, but the point where I couldn't actually cross was the point when I wanted to create a new assembly that was a modified version of the old one. And that
Sure.
was an interesting challenge for me. And then like a lot of devs, instead of trying to climb the hill myself, I found other people that were able to do it.
Yeah.
And I've already done it.
Yeah. And that's great, right? Like, in a vacuum, like we can only resolve X amount of problems, right? But like if we continue to grow our network of people to help us, like it allows us to be able to really accomplish like great things, right? Like that's not to say that there haven't been people that have been very extremely successful like building things themselves, but I think at the end of the day, like we are far more successful with the help of others.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, I think, you mentioned that you're kind of a retired developer, right? You're an engineering manager right now. I'd like to kind of get your
Mhm.
thoughts about like how, like what your mindset is around like, heart, bringing forward like the new wave of developers and how, we can make sure that developers are aware of things like GitHub in a more, I guess, controllable fashion, and thinking about ways to extend the work of other developers. Like how like what is it like between the time when you were a developer and now you see the developers and how they work? How is that? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Um, it's like I said, it really is a mixed bag, because as somebody who's not actively doing dev for work, I mean, that is back compared to the days when I was just doing nothing but coding. I mean, I always joke with my own team and say that C# is not no longer my primary language, programming language of choice. It's actually English, because I work with devs. I don't work with the actual code directly. There's still things I still look into, but primarily it's just looking after the next generation and making sure they do well. Now the difference now is that it depends on the technologies that or the particular skill set. Of course, there's the myth of the so-called full stack dev, but let's be honest, there's so much to learn on the front end and the back end
Yep.
that it would be unreasonable to say that anybody with less than, say, 4 or 5 years of experience could be a full stack dev, because there's just so many things you have to master. There's certain ways you can work around it by using the right tools, but of course, the challenge with today's generation is not for a lack of training, because there's lots of different places that you can go to learn this stuff. But I guess it's just finding the right guidance. Because yes, you can do the trial by fire, and you can learn, go to the school of hard knocks and crash and burn a few times. Yeah, that will work in some instances. But finding the right mentor and finding the right people that would guide you and point you in the right direction is going to make a difference.
I wholeheartedly agree. Go ahead, continue.
Yeah, I mean, so for the most part, with the next gen of devs, it's the challenge is really focus. In the age of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I mean, there's just so much information that you have to sift through to find the right source. Just to be able to get things done, it can be overwhelming. It's like one of my favorite books is The Paradox of Choice, where it turns out that the more options you are, the happier you are, because it can be overwhelming, and the human mind can only just take so many different inputs before it gets overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So to your point, it comes down to a few things. Number one, knowing where to look. Number two, finding the right people to learn from. And three would be finding the right environments to work in that would foster that kind of development. And then there's so many different places you can go, but yeah, it's always going to be that challenge. For me, I mean, I'm not retired in the real sense.
Sure.
But I like to think of myself as I'm no longer on the front line. I'm no longer on the firing line where the code that I cut is pretty much going to define what I do. It's as a manager, it's more like what my team does and what I do for them, and how do I develop them is going to make a bigger difference in how I do, rather than whatever awesome code that I think I have, and then you throw it away in 6 months anyway.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, keep going.
No, keep going. That's fine.
No, I just there's something you said, like there's a lot that you said there that I thought that was really interesting. I think one of the things that you said right at the beginning that was very interesting is like this concept of like full stack developer, right? I agree that like that is an unfair task to put on somebody, like understanding the entire web ecosystem and just be able to work in all facets successfully. I'm even of the mindset too where there's not even such thing as a back-end developer or a front-end developer. Like even those roles that's not even fair. Because in the back-end space, like, okay, are you building microservices? Are you building NT architecture? Are you using Kubernetes? Are you using different data platforms? Like, how are you, like, what languages are you talking about? Like, and then on the front-end side, like, you have JavaScript wars, you have CSS wars, you have WebAssembly, you have all these different things, right? Like, how it's unfair to expect anybody to be able to, like, know the work of literally tens of thousands of different developers and be able to kind of absorb all of that into a way for you to be a front-end developer. At least that's my 2 cents on it. Like, I think that they're nice nomenclatures to use when it comes to leveling and hiring. But if you were to ask me, like, are you a front-end or back-end developer? I'm just a developer. Like, I'm just trying to get by. Which I think I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I'm a firm believer that unless you've been studying this for a very long time, you could either be one or the other, or you be specialized in one particular portion of it. I mean, I remember there's a GitHub repo that actually talks about the list of things that you would have to learn as one of three things. There's a front end dev, a back end dev, or somebody within ops or DevOps. And it's a very famous repo on GitHub if I can find it. But essentially, it's a career path. So if you learn these things and you master them well, then you could be in this particular category.
Sure.
So yes, I mean the one thing that can't be said enough is that there is a difference between the artisan dev or the hobbyist dev that just does it for fun. Like that's where I started, versus the commercial, the day-to-day software engineer that is actually getting paid, and that has more to do with all the trade-offs that you have to make in order to get things out the door.
Yeah.
And these trade-offs could be anything related to technical debts, and just sacrificing a little bit of quality to make sure we get things shipped and then paying it back later, or just deciding to cut features because you realize you don't have enough time. Now, as a hobbyist dev, I didn't have to worry about that. For me, when I was starting off, I would actually just look at, for example, if I was pretty much a big fan of building IOC containers. So I would start off with a list of all the features that one container framework would have. And since I was just coding for fun, I would see how far I could make it all the way down that list and actually get to it. And then compare the results and see how well I was doing, because I wanted to practice.
Sure.
Now, if this was a commercial setup when I was working inside of dev team in Microsoft, for example, or some other company, I wouldn't have all that time to do that. I'd have to make quite a few trade-offs because the business needs to make money and they need to have it by this date. And so how I see it is, yes, it's if you're a dev, you're doing it for fun. It's so much different from your day-to-day when you actually have to be able to ship things. I dare say that a part of my innocence was taken away because I frequently had to make those kinds of trade-offs in just to make bank, and that's perfectly fair and that's fine. But gone are the days where I could just code away for like 14 hours and just live on coffee and enjoy it, and have the music turned all the way up in my room, and I didn't have to worry about anything else. But yeah, but there is a balance. For me, with open source, I always say, hey, if you want anything that is commercially packageable, then you're gonna have to pay me. But if you want to see what I do or what I can do, then there's always my GitHub.
Yeah, I think
my advice to a lot of devs is treat GitHub the same way a lot of artists treat their portfolio, or a lot of designers treat their portfolio. It's not to say that your portfolio is all that you can do, but it's just a sample of what you can do in the right circumstances. And at the same time, you can't really do much with it other than say, hey, that looks pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing to think about. It's like you're talking about building a portfolio as like an artist, or I think that's great. I think where unfortunately things have started to turn in the last 2 or 3 years is, if you don't have a GitHub presence, like you're not like a real developer. So like it's one of those things, like I've seen enough like recruiters asking for GitHub links, or people calling out like how busy like their contribution map is and stuff like that. And there's a lot of people
it really depends on the market as well, because the market here in Australia is vastly different from that in the US.
Sure.
So, for example, here locally, some companies ask for a GitHub profile, but for the most part, there's such a shortage because of the borders being closed here in Australia that they're not as picky. There
Sure.
is a bit of gatekeeping, but it's very rare. Um, I like to think because it's hard enough getting a good dev, um, but even then, when you can get one, the challenge that they have here in the local market is they only stay for a year, and then all of a sudden you're into the same boat anyway. So it's not to say that there are people out there that do that, and I highly discourage that because it's. I'd like to say that doing dev in itself is damn hard as it is.
Sure.
It does not make sense to keep other people out of something that already needs more people to help.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
So, yeah, if you're gonna shine on and say, "Yeah, I'm better than you," and you can't do this, if you can't do this, you're not one of us. Then let this be a record for eternity, and I will say to every single one of them, "I do not want to work with you."
Yeah.
Like, come on, man, or woman, you can do better than this.
Yeah, I think there's something to say too about like we only want positivity in these spaces, right? Like we deal with a lot of drama for work, we deal with a lot of drama in our personal life, and for a lot of people, like open source is a hobby for people because they actually enjoy doing it. And the last thing that I want is there to be drama like in the thing that I want to do for fun, right? I think that's one of the things that I really really enjoy about having these conversations is getting different insight on how different people think about how developers should be treated by the community. I think it's really really great, or how developers should be treated by large entities. I think one thing that's really interesting that you said too is like this idea of like gatekeeping, right? Like you mentioned it in the sense of trying to find like candidates for jobs, right? But I think in general, like tech has a lot of gatekeeping. And it's really, at the onus of the developer to kind of navigate all those gates, right? Like what are your thoughts on ways that we could kind of reduce the friction or kind of lower the fence, I guess you could say, for folks that are coming into the tech space?
I say give them the tools to get rid of the trolls. That is, let them block in mass
Sure.
and have ways to expose the people who make their lives more miserable. Level the playing field
Sure.
because I'm in terms of free speech. There's a fine line there. I would say yes, you have the right to say whatever you want, but at the same time, I got a right to block whoever the hell I want.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and for people just starting out, the worst thing is some person that thinks they're 10 times better than you because chronologically they've been around longer than you.
Sure.
But if you think in 4 dimensions, it doesn't mean anything.
It's very true.
Because that person that was there for 10, 20 years started off the same place as that person who's been there for 1 year. And that's not even counting in the fact that some of them are women, which is even harder to find in the tech industry, not because they're incapable of doing the same job. They can do it. It's because they've got lots of people who are basically saying, you know what, I don't think you can do it. You need to stay away. Or you need to pass this test before we'll count you as one of us.
Yeah. I
And
mean, good.
it's and of course depending on who you talk to, it's not a lot of people have the same kind of thick skin. It's not because they don't have the capacity to, but it it almost seems like you have to claw your way in even from the first year. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely we want to make sure that we're not building circles, we're building U's, right? We want to be able to bring in developers and people that are maybe not developers, but they want to be in technical communities, bring them in. Because there's a lot of people in the tech space that aren't developers. There's project managers, there's technical writers, there's ops folks. There's lots of people in tech that aren't developers. So discounting them because they're not a developer is kind of a bummer. And it's great to hear that you and I agree on this how we can do better is by giving these people that are just joining communities tools and the voice to be able to, you know, build their own space that they feel comfortable in.
Yeah, and I'm going to go against Green and say gatekeeping would make sense if there's an overflow of talent and
Sure.
capability that we said, you know what, we can't, there's just too much. We can't, there's no way that we can afford to have more people.
Yeah.
But I don't see that at all in tech.
No. No.
I see the opposite, where companies are struggling to find the right people, or it just, aside from stroking your own ego and saying I'm better than this person and they didn't really tick my boxes or meet my standards, it didn't really help anybody.
Yeah, it's totally true. I think,
So
yeah. Did you have something to say? Sorry.
no, I just it only makes sense when you look at it from, and you zoom out and you take a step back and say, why are we doing this? Why are we
Yeah.
making it so hard for people to join an industry that's already struggling to find the right people?
Yeah. There's something to that for sure. And I think, one of the things that I really appreciate about these sort of conversations is, we get, it's about amplifying these underrepresented voices, right? Like new developers or people that have different roles in tech. Like, I think one of the things that, and this is kind of like the last question before we close, is like, you know, what are some of the things that you feel like we can do better to, like, obviously about championing people and giving them tools, but like, do we have an advocacy problem in tech? Like, do we not tell people how great tech is, or do people from the outside see tech and they're like, oh, it's very toxic, I don't want to be a part of that? Like, how do we get new people to come into tech? Not just how do we keep people that are new in tech?
I I I mean, this is completely unsubstantiated, but this is my opinion. I think tech has been dominated by men so much that we have practices that pull in by more men than women, and we end up losing a lot of people because of how we attract people.
Sure.
Uh, there's a different conversation around whether or not different genders can perform the same job. I believe they can, but the problem is really we end up. It's not just gatekeeping, but we end up pulling in and attracting the wrong people at the door.
Sure.
Uh, so if the question is how do we encourage that, I've seen few practices or even changing the language in a job ad encourages more people to apply that otherwise wouldn't apply because of how they phrase certain things. It's not about being politically correct. No, it's just saying things in such a way that it's tricky.
Yeah.
It's really tricky because if and I'm grossly generalizing, but what I would say is
Yeah.
that as somebody who's a male, if I wanted to bring in somebody who's also a male, I would challenge them and say, "Can you do this? Are you good enough?"
Hmm.
But that kind of language isn't really going to work with somebody who's a female.
Sure.
Um, and they might even have the same amount of skills, but they say, "Well, I'm not sure, kind of sure about this environment," or I'll just go for something that's not as in your face,
Sure.
and just being able to switch it to something that says, "Well, if you're the type of person that can do these things, then we want you to work for us."
Yeah. No, it's
So
definitely all valid
it's
points.
very subtle, and it's not, and there's no clear cut way to do this. But if you want to move towards that kind of diversity, then you have to change the language to match the diversity that you want to have.
Totally agree. That's
Otherwise, you
awesome.
get an echo chamber. Otherwise you get an echo chamber, and you're stuck in the same boat because you're making the same decisions and you don't have the different perspectives that would be able to steer the ship in the right direction.
That's awesome. And I think with that, I think that's a perfect place to end the conversation. So, Philip, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on, chatting with me. Hopefully, you enjoy the rest of your morning in beautiful Australia. And again, thank you so much for being a part, and for everybody here as well. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was a pleasure chatting. And do you have any parting words to say, Philip?
No, that's pretty much it. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.